begin our series watching how art manifests itself through cultures and across time, we are going to be looking at art in very general terms in the major continents across the world. But I realized that ancient Egypt itself was going to need to stand apart from African art. One reason being because ancient Egyptian art is so well documented that there is just a lot of it for us to be able to look at in very specific examples, and also because the ancient Egyptian kingdoms are separated geographically from the major part of Africa and actually have a lot in common with Mesopotamian eras and those cultures and kingdoms like the Babylonians and Assyrians, just as much as it has connections with the general African continent. So in terms of recorded history of humanity, Egyptian civilization is old, very old. To put it into perspective, when the biblical Jesus went to Egypt, if he was walking by the pyramids, they would likely have already been older to him than he is to us now. Human culture, the oldest recordings of human culture that we have and civilizations are from the Fertile Crescent. The oldest civilizations in the world, the Babylonians, Assyrians, then the Persians and the Egyptians as well come from this area. And while there is a lot of really impressive things to learn from any of these cultures, Egypt stands out for a couple of reasons. One, the longevity of its rule in a variety of forms, its relative stability compared to a lot of other kingdoms, and a series of coincidences and mindsets dealing with religion and geography that wound up preserving large amounts of artifacts in a way that wasn't pulled apart and discovered and dispersed through civilizations until very recently. Ancient Egyptians did not think about the word art in the terms that we do today. Ancient Egyptians, as many cultures, did not actually have a word for art. They might have a word for a statue or a stela or a temple or a painting, but the concept of art as being a removed entity in which it is separate from other things like science, like mathematics, like religion, it doesn't really appear. They don't gather works in museums or galleries, and they don't appreciate objects just based on their aesthetics alone, aesthetics being the judgment or the evaluation of appearances. And this has a lot to do with ancient Egyptian culture, and especially the culture being shaped by the land that Egyptians inhabited. The Nile provides a source of nourishment for a small strip of land that the Egyptians would call the Kemet, amidst a vast infertile area, which they called the Deseret. The regular cycle of the flooding of the Nile provided crops a constant system of fertility, a balance of order amidst the harsh backdrop of the chaos, famine, and poverty of the desert. And in this cycle, there were times of plenty and times of scarcity, but these times were often very regularly spaced so that it could be planned for. This system shaped the mythology and the religion of Egypt, the political infrastructure, and the daily lives and social classes of its citizens. Because of this belief that order depends on respect for authority. So if the pharaoh, who is a demigod, is pleased and in charge and in power, then things will go well. Egypt develops into a relatively stable country, with ruling families having access to vast amounts of resources and incredible amounts of power. And so the remains of Egyptian art show testament to these Egyptian rulers, the highest and the most powerful people in the land. It is these few elite who are able to control vast amounts of wealth and that access allows them to draw great architects and innovators and to command massive labor forces that are required to enact the feats of building and design that we can still wonder at 4,000 years later, using tools no more sophisticated than hammers, chisels, and wheels. The amount of work it must have taken to engineer and actually see through the creation of a temple on this scale come to fruition, utilizing little more than hand tools, is pretty astonishing. This temple of Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's few female pharaohs, was dedicated to the sun god Amun. Amun, or Amun-Ra, or Ra, depending on his particular incarnation, was one of the most powerful gods because he represented the sun, the source of life, and was strongly connected to the power of the pharaoh, which is why we keep seeing Ra pop up often in Egyptian temples. It made sense that pharaohs would want to build temples to Ra if Ra was the god that was also the patron of pharaohs. The people in power are going to reinforce the traditions that perpetuate their standing. So because power was so important to the structure of ancient Egyptian society, artists were dedicated to making sure their works communicated that aspect as clearly as possible. When comparing Egyptian works to works inspired by naturalism, so Egyptian works are very abstracted or stylized, it's important to keep those priorities in mind so that we don't mistake a difference in goals as signs of artists who cannot master naturalistic representation. So all pharaohs in Egyptian culture were designated by common features so that they would be recognized as holding the position of the pharaoh. Hatshepsut in this statue wears a beard on her face because all pharaohs wear this beard, despite whether or not they could actually grow facial hair. As she strides forward, the space between her legs is filled and not carved out, not because the artist couldn't master the ability to carve out a space between her legs, but because leaving that space filled enforces the ideas of her stability and the stability of her rule by connection with a representation of her body. Statues like these are not designed to be walked around and admired from all angles. These were believed to house the spirit of the god or the pharaoh, who is also a god, in their physical beings. These statues were placed in temples before spaces where rituals or offerings were laid out, and thus they have a very formal front-facing stance. In Egyptian religion, the pharaoh needs these offerings. He needs the remembrance and the attention of priests and religious followers in order to maintain their godlike status in the underworld. To be forgotten as a pharaoh is to experience eternal death. So the statue is directing its entire attention to receive the sacrament because that sacrament is so important. Because Egyptians believed that their way of life depended on the gods to prevent chaos, and the gods depended on the devotion of the people, it was absolutely vital then that the artworks did their job. Statues of Egyptian pharaohs tend to look like one another. They possess similar facial features in spite of what the actual person may or may not have looked like. This shows then how the person fits the role of the pharaoh, how they possess the qualities of one who is destined to lead. What matters in ancient Egypt is not what the pharaoh looked like, but what he represented. You can see this beautifully illustrated many thousands of years later during the Ptolemaic era in portraits commissioned by Cleopatra of herself that she sent to different regions as propaganda. In her Roman commissioned portraits, she assures Roman citizens that she is a person of culture and learning, that she is the equal of Roman leaders like Julius Caesar as the mother of his child and heir. This Roman sculpture is done in a very naturalistic style, closer to reality and humanism. In the Egyptian portrait, though, she respects tradition. saying that she fulfills the requirements of a traditional pharaoh, even though Cleopatra was actually from the Ptolemaic line, a Greek family who was given power by Alexander the Great. Nevertheless, in this basalt sculpture, she strides forward in confidence, with the space between her legs filled as a symbol of stability, while wearing the headdress of the pharaohs and possessing highly stylized features. In hieroglyphs, we have a look into ancient Egyptian language. The hieroglyph, as seen in many tombs, combines some of the conventions of written text with the freedom of visual imagery. Some hieroglyphs correlate to phonetic sounds, so they operate like letters of our modern alphabet. And other times they may stand in for a metaphorical idea. Accompanying these were figures and drawings illustrating those ideas. So just like text is meant to convey information in your book through linguistics, these paintings were meant to contain as much information as possible. This is why you see so many of those classically, quote-unquote, impossible Egyptian poses or multiple perspectives drawn in one scene. The point of those figures is to be descriptive, to communicate. So the artist is going to give you the maximum amount of information that you can get from the human figure, even if that means that the way that they draw the human figure is a way that humans don't pose naturally. The powerful also constructed great tombs, which acted as a final monument and guide for the resting place of powerful people's bodies. This could be pharaohs, but it could also be powerful people in the pharaoh's court. Often tombs were constructed throughout the lifetime of the person who was going to live in it. And this was built on the belief system that the afterlife hinged upon preparation while living, that you had to put in things you would need later, like furniture, boats, food, even your slaves, so that you could be prepared to be taken care of in the afterlife. This is one of those coincidences that I was talking about that is a large reason why we know so much about ancient Egyptians even now, even when they are so far removed from our time. These objects and instructions and beautiful hieroglyphs were put into these basically airtight, super dry boxes because Egypt is on the edge of a desert. And they would be put into these perfectly situated rooms to preserve these objects. And then because of religious customs, were not meant to be disturbed, although many were looted and plundered over the years. Pharaohs wanted monuments to preserve their godly status forever. Imhotep, one of the great ancient architects, designed this step pyramid for Djoser as part of an elaborate temple complex. The pyramid itself was the king's tomb, while the temples for worship were originally built to the side to collect the offerings that would keep him sustained in the afterlife. The pyramid itself went through many evolutions before perfecting what we think of today at Giza. Some pyramids were engineered as they went along. Here you can see where the original angle of the pyramid was going to be too steep, and the architect had to compensate with a much shallower slope, therefore giving the pyramid a bent look. In hieroglyphs, pyramids are the symbols for the rays of sun, which we just discovered were associated with pharaohs. So pharaohs were then being entombed in metaphorical rays of sun. And these were originally capped with white limestone that was polished. And then there was a golden tip at the very top so that these pyramids actually shone in the light the way that a sun ray does. And their celestial alignments allowed shafts to connect the pharaoh's chambers with objects in the sky at certain periods of the year. Each pyramid also had its own temple complex, so worship for the pharaoh could be channeled to him. And you can already see in those very symbolic pyramids, and in these temples as well, there is a pattern going on, one of agenda and of bias. And you're going to see that come up again and again throughout this course. We are only seeing slices of life from the most elite in ancient Egypt, the very upper class in the civilization, because they were the ones who had enough resources to make sure that their stories got told. Here in this temple dedicated to Ramses, we have column after column shaped in Ramses' image saying, I am super important. I am a very important guy, and I literally am the foundation that is holding up your sacred place of worship. And so, because these are the people who are writing history, it's their story that gets told. Ramses orders the story to be told of his defeat of the Hittites. Notice how large he is compared to every other figure in this work. He is the most important person. His body is focused and rigid and aligned to a 90-degree grid, while his enemies are tiny and their bodies are in disarray, tossed to and fro in their weakness and chaos. Of course, not every single pharaoh in ancient Egypt, despite the many dynasties, followed this model. There was a period of huge upset in Egypt that we know of, mostly because of, again, another lucky coincidence in uncovering some artifacts, especially in the tomb of King Tut. King Tut's reign was rooted in that of his parents, Nefertiti and Akhenaten. These two not only changed ancient Egyptian religion into a monotheistic culture, worshiping the sun disk Aten rather than the god Ra, they also radically changed the style of art that they were depicting, favoring a more naturalistic depiction, and they relocated the capital of Egypt to an entirely new city that they built, which they also called Akhenaten. So Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their children can be seen here bathing in the glory of Aten. This new way of life revolved around the sun disk, and names were changed in a reference to their loyalty to Aten as opposed to Amun-Ra. And this change, this radical shift away from a polytheistic to a monotheistic culture, was deeply unpopular, especially amongst the priests who had previously been enjoying the power related to worship of their temples. The child that inherited their throne after Nefertiti and Akhenaten died was plagued by disease and also, generally speaking, ruled more by his counsel than his own decisions before his young death. Tutankhamun, as he was known during his lifetime while the monotheistic religion was still in play, changed his name to Tutankhamun once the priests who acted as his council switched back to the polytheistic religion. We may not have even known about King Tut at all if it hadn't been for the fact that he was such an inconsequential pharaoh who lived such a short reign. Even though by today's standards his tomb seems fabulously wealthy, it was in fact, compared to other pharaohs, so small and insignificant and inconsequential that it was forgotten in the record books, which is why no one ever found it until the 1920s. And what this does is this reflects why some things in ancient art are well known, but others simply aren't. Sometimes the reason why we know about a certain culture, a certain artwork, or a certain artist is just a happenstance of chance and preservation and the luck of public opinion at the particular time. What was popular in ancient Egypt at its time is maybe something that we don't even know about today. So it's interesting to think, and this is something you should be thinking about as you continue with this class and as you go on out into the world in general. What are the circumstances that are leading me to the information that I have now? How did history get written for me?